On February 2, 1769, the bells of St. Peter, the big bell in St. Peter's, began to toll quite slowly. Two clerics walking across the square, one of them said to the other, "Ah, it is the deaths of our Holy Father." And the other said, "That may well be, but it's also the priest bringing the last sacraments to the Society of Jesus." I'm going to be talking here about the suppression, the survival, and the restoration of the Society. It begins a little before Clement XIII, but that's a good place to start my narration because when he died, immediately the courts of Europe were interested in who was going to be appointed or who was going to be elected the next pope. What I'm going to try to do in this talk, let me give you a brief outline of it, and that's simply to talk about the circumstances antecedent to or before the suppression itself, then the internal and external circumstances that the Society itself was involved in, then the national banishments prior to the suppression itself, from Portugal, from Spain, from France, from Naples, then the suppression, then the survival of the Society in the years after 1773 to 1814 in Russia, and then the restoration of the Society. That's basically what the outline of this whole project is. Let me begin with the circumstances of the Society itself before the suppression. It's a series of things that most people don't know much about. First of all, the Society of Jesus was the largest order in the church at the time. It was about 22,000 members, according to the last catalogue or so that we have before the suppression. Secondly, it was certainly the largest missionary order in the church. And surprisingly, until 1622, there was no central office in Rome at the Vatican for the evangelization of people, what was called later the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith. That only got started partly at the suggestion of the Jesuits that late in the history of the papacy. The Society itself was not only the largest order in the church and the largest missionary order, it was distinguished in a lot of ways for the way in which it lived its life. The Society was not regarded at the time as a particularly austere order, but it had a reputation for being serious, not a lax order at all. The other religious orders in the church at the time, some of them were larger than the Society. The Dominicans were something like 25,000 members. The Franciscans altogether were up in the 70s, between 70,000 and 100,000. Many of the other orders at the time were close to the size of the Society, but the most interesting thing is that after the French Revolution, no order in the church, except the Society of Jesus and the Christian Brothers, ever became as big again, as large again with the number of members as it had before the French Revolution. It's also important to recognize the situation of religious orders in comparison with the diocesan clergy at the time. To take only one example, how many people are there in the state in which you happen to live? Ordinary people. Well, in Naples, the Kingdom of Naples at the time, there were probably about 3 million people, and there were about 30,000 diocesan priests. Would you want that same proportion of diocesan priests in your own state in which you're living at the time? No wonder they would be standing outside the churches, some of them arguing with others about how much they would charge to say a Mass. They lived on some of those kinds of stipends. Next, beyond that, the Society was certainly the most influential order in the church at the time. It was involved that way especially because of the vast network of schools, better than 700 or so of them, around the world that had begun fairly soon after the foundation of the order at the time of Ignatius, far differently than he had originally expected the Society to be like. But 700 or so schools with the Ratio Studiorum teaching essentially the same structured education from Krakow in Poland to Cuzco in Peru, or from Monreale in Sicily to Montreal or Montreal in Canada. That was an extraordinary set of circumstances that made us influential. As I said, we had a reputation for seriousness. We were comfortable, not austere, but we were not lax either. We were the confessors of kings. And whether that was good or not, it excited a lot of interest and a certain amount of envy and a certain amount of suspicion on the part of a good number of people. Congregation after congregation and general after general said to the people who were the confessors of kings, you're to be confessors for them simply for their own personal life, and then you're not to meddle in statecraft. But how do you separate those things out when the king was the representative of the nation at the time? That brought influence, but it also brought envy, as I said, and suspicion. For example, we were the confessor of the most powerful king in Europe at the time, at Louis XIII, and then the most powerful Louis XIV. Once a week, Père de la Chaise and the previous confessors would meet with the king. Was it just for the benefit of his own personal soul? People certainly were interested in the fact that Tuesdays were the day on which the king went over the list of possible candidates that he would nominate for bishoprics in France. It happened to be the same day that Père de la Chaise, his Jesuit confessor, met with him. People drew their own conclusions from that, whether they were correct or not. It's an example of the kind of things that happen. And if the King of France had a Jesuit confessor, well, then almost every other king, duke, prince, and so on in Europe, aping or imitating the King of France, had to have his own Jesuit confessor too. It brought a lot of problems. For example, at one point, the Jesuit confessor of the King of France during the 30 Years' War reassured him that he was living up to his obligations as king by engaging in that war, fighting against the empire, while the Jesuit confessor of the Holy Roman Emperor was assuring his sovereign that he was doing the will of God by fighting the French king in the 30 Years' War. Can you imagine the conflict that that brought? We were also influential partly because of the publications and the authors that we had doing some of the most seminal work at the time in theology, Suarez, for example, in science, Clavius, a man who was, among others, very responsible for our Gregorian calendar of the present day, in history, the Bollandists, who began to take seriously the lives of the saints and do serious studies of and publications about them. That influence also got us involved in theological disputes with Jansenism as to the nature of the relationship of God to the human being, man and woman, and their free will. We were involved in theological disputes as far as the Chinese and Malabar rites go. How appropriate was it, for example, in China, the Chinese people engaged in the veneration of their ancestors and the veneration of Confucius? Was this superstitious idolatry, or was it simply a social phenomenon? The church judged that it was superstition, and this, without really knowing exactly what was going on, it banned all of those rites, formally and officially, and at least indirectly brought about the near destruction of the church in China for a good long time after that. There was enemy publicity about the Society of Jesus. All you have to do is read the Philosophes, Diderot, Voltaire, D'Alembert, the Dictionnaire, to see how the society was pilloried from top to bottom. Voltaire would consistently write little poems about the Jesuits, and I wish I had one of them with me, about the Jesuits. How did he put it? But Jesus Christ crucified between two thieves, one of whom was a Jesuit, and I forget the member of it, but between two thieves, both of whom were Jesuits. Just the kinds of things that were said about the society. We were wedded in some ways to the old order in education. The ratio had been officially what we were working with or what we were using in educating people, but as a matter of fact, we had moved beyond that in many ways in history, geography, and so on and so on. But with the rise of natural science, with Newton and so on, people accused the society of neglecting that in favor simply of an Aristotelian physics, which was certainly outmoded. Finally, there were gathering storms, and people could see that there were gathering storms as to the relationship of the state and the church, especially the determination on the part of the regalists, the formal political advisors of the kings, that the governments of the various national states should be responsible, and they alone responsible, for how the church lived in their own domains. Apart from official dogma, everything else would be decided by the king. But the Society of Jesus is an international order at the service of an international institution. The papacy was obviously, in those kind of situations, regarded with great suspicion. You can't possibly, not deny that. Those are some of the circumstances internal to the society itself.